From deep within the undrained Republican-filled swamps of Florida, this is the Krassencast, defending what's left, with hosts Brian and Ed Krassenstein.
And welcome to Krassencast. With the Mueller report still hidden away, our listeners have had so many important questions. This is why we have a special guest today to dissect what the report may say and why the Trump administration appears to be doing everything in their power to hide it from the American people. Today we have on our show David Katz. He's a former assistant U.S. attorney based in L.A., a current criminal defense attorney in Beverly Hills, and a former member of the Reagan Administration. He's here today to discuss the Mueller report, which I remind you we have not actually seen yet, as well as several other investigations into the president and his family. Can you introduce yourself any further, David?
Well, yes, I'm working on cases. Sometimes they're white-collar criminal defense cases. So I've represented people who are in the same kind of situation as, let's say, Manafort or even Michael Cohen. I've represented actually a lot of other attorneys who are in trouble as their criminal defense attorney. I haven't represented anyone like Donald Trump, I must say that.
So it's relatively clear that from Barr's report, Mueller didn't find any evidence to indict or convict the president for conspiring with the Russian government to obtain help during the 2016 election. The standard here should be proof beyond a reasonable doubt. I mean, did we really think that Russia would be careless enough to leave any direct link back to their government?
Well, that's a very good point. Some of those people seem like cutouts. That lady who showed up at Trump Tower and said she had dirt from the Russian government, she had positions in the Russian government or linked to the Russian government. She represented Russia in a very important lawsuit in federal court in New York. So she wasn't just some, hanger-on, some nobody. She was very involved in trying to amend that Magnitsky Act, which apparently was extremely important to Putin and to Russian diplomacy to try to get that act altered to try to have less sanctions under it. And that was something that there certainly were indications that Trump and his people would help with. Well, that was a critical meeting, and I think Russia really did make a lot of mistakes in terms of their spy craft, their trade craft, that made a very strong case. I think if it had not been, let's assume the president, Trump, had lost and weren't in control of dangling pardons and couldn't exert his influence if it wasn't obstruction of justice. Certainly, if he couldn't weigh on the scale as much as he did to try to not have investigations done, I think there would have been a very strong case. I think Trump, private citizen, gets indicted along with Donald Trump Jr. For exactly what we know about the Trump Tower meeting, including Trump Jr. sending the email that said, if you've got what you say you have, dirt from the Russian government on Hillary Clinton, I'd love it. Come to the meeting. And then you have the whole cover-up, which the president and his son-in-law were involved in, misrepresenting what really had happened at that meeting, not coming clean about it. And as you recall, that actually blew up where the president had drafted something on Air Force One that purported to be from the son or from somebody else.
I just want to clarify that woman you're referring to who met at Trump Tower was Natalia Veselnitskaya. And I want to clarify something that Brian said. He said that Mueller didn't find any evidence to indict and convict. But I think we can assume that he did find evidence to some evidence, but just not enough to indict and convict. Would you agree?
Yes, I would, because he'd have to find, as a federal prosecutor, we couldn't just throw something on the wall and hope that the jury would convict. We didn't indict on a probable cause standard, and neither would Mueller recommend indicting on a standard of, well, it was more likely than not. He'd have to be convinced that there was proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And look at the hurdles, the obstacles that were put in the way of Mueller in trying to say that there was proof beyond a reasonable doubt and that he would surely convict the president if he charged him and would surely convict Donald Trump Jr. if he'd have charged him for the Trump Tower meeting and the cover-up. Manafort, instead of cooperating, which he promised he would do, ended up actually taking information from the proffer sessions, saying what the special prosecutor's questions were, and leaking them through his lawyers to the Trump team. There were people who were still in a criminal defense agreement, like Michael Cohen, while he was being investigated. When he testified in Congress about Russian interference in the election and Trump's collusion with it, he was still part of a criminal defense agreement with Trump. And that was one of the reasons why he said himself, Cohn, when he pled guilty, that he had lied to the Congress and said that the negotiations for Trump Tower Moscow had stopped in January, whereas the truth was they'd continued throughout the presidential campaign in 2016, all the way to the end. And when Russia, according to Trump, when Trump said, "Oh, I have nothing to do with Russia," that was false at the time it was stated. And it's from Michael Cohen as the lawyer. He said that he consulted with Trump's lawyers, the same ones who are crowing now what a great job they did as criminal defense attorneys to get Trump off, to get Trump not indicted, to get Trump declined on. Those lawyers, according to Cohen and his sworn testimony now, is that they reviewed his inaccurate testimony to Congress, his false testimony to Congress. That's a very serious allegation to be made against those lawyers, I guess Giuliani, Sokolow, and a couple of the others.
So, in other words, the obstructions actually worked.
Well, when we get to the obstruction, yes, an obstruction does not have to work in order to be charged. An attempt to obstruct justice constitutes the crime of obstruction of justice, and it is complicated just in sort of common sense how jurors think about it. If you get charged with tampering with a witness, let's say you hide a witness, but it turns out that you had an ironclad alibi, people will say, well, maybe the guy freaked out. He did something with the witness he shouldn't have done. And he did, after all, have an alibi for the crime that the witness was going to testify about. So there's this common sense feeling that the obstruction of justice, there should have been some justice to the charge in the first place. But legally, there's no claim, there's no requirement that it has to be collusion or conspiracy in order to support the obstruction of justice. So what I'm saying is that that charge could have stood all on its own, obstruction of justice or attempted obstruction of justice. And this is one of the weird things and why it's so necessary that Congress and the public see the actual Mueller report, because it's inexplicable, since he had a mandate to look into obstruction of justice, why he didn't say, I would prosecute, I would not prosecute. My own hunch is that there's damning evidence for obstruction of justice, damning evidence to indict the president and maybe other people for obstruction of justice, but he just didn't take a position on it. Mueller just didn't take a position on it. And I know people have a lot of respect for Mueller, but he is a Republican who was investigating a Republican president. Let's not fool ourselves. Starr was a Republican looking into a Democratic president, Clinton. And when you had Archibald Cox and his team, they were perceived as Democrats who were going after Republican President Nixon. This is a Republican on a Republican, and now it's all been sifted and edited and condensed and maybe completely mischaracterized by this 4-page Barr letter, which is all we have.
Yeah, do you feel that Mueller intended to punt this to Barr or punt this decision to Congress?
I think he intended to punt it to Congress. I think it's really been intercepted by Barr. And I think we need to be very clear-eyed about Barr. Barr wrote a 19-page summary of his views on obstruction of justice. No one asked him for it. It was like an audition, like handing your card to somebody and saying, hire me, look at my views on obstruction of justice. They're very, very much what you want to hear, Mr. President. That is what Trump wanted to hear. They cherry-picked this guy. Why he'd go back to government after he's already been attorney general and leave a posh firm is also weird. I've speculated, and I think there's some basis for it, that he hopes to be the next pick on the Supreme Court if the opening comes clear. So I believe he hopes to be rewarded. And this whole thing, I think, is very, very suspicious, where he takes a position a priori on there's no obstruction of justice, because his view, and it's a radical view, I don't agree with it, I don't think most lawyers agree with it, is that because the president is the president, because he's in charge of enforcing the laws, he is justice, like the king who said, I'm the whatever, there's this the state, c'est moi, right? This is like justice, c'est moi. And therefore, because he is justice, the president, he can't obstruct justice. It's just weird.
It was like he basically used that 19-page op-ed to act as a resume for the opening in the DOJ. And then Trump took that resume and said, hey, this is a good candidate. I'm going to hire him. He's going to help me obstruct justice. It was almost like that.
I don't think that's even so much an opinion. I think that if you look at the sequence of events, it's very disturbing. The Democrats were on that topic and they started to say, hey, wait a second, we have real questions about this. What are you going to do regarding the Mueller report when it's finally filed with you? And he gave some really mealy-mouthed answers. And then the Democrats just about all voted against him. But there were, I think, 53 Republicans, and they put him on in the Attorney General spot. On a totally partisan basis. So you've had this, I think, very partisan letter, and I think the House is coming to that view. And every day that it's not turned over to them, they're more and more suspicious that this was just sort of a veneer. This was just like a propaganda thing so that for a week, or maybe it'll be 2 weeks, or maybe it'll be a month, people go around and Trump goes around and says, I was cleared. As we said already, this report could not clear him in any way, shape, or form, the Mueller report, to not be guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of conspiracy with the Russians. That's practically treason. So, yes, he is not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, in the opinion of a fellow Republican, of conspiring with the Russians. That's not a very good recommendation to be the president or continue to be the president. You beat the rap on something just about amounting to treason.
Now, Congress has given him until April 2nd to turn over the full report. If he doesn't, Congress will probably subpoena him. And then what happens? How long could that be held up in court?
Well, unfortunately, the courts can take a while to act. I don't think this is one where the Trump administration hopes to ultimately win. I think the example here is the Nixon case, where Nixon's own appointees to the Supreme Court voted against Nixon, and the Supreme Court voted unanimously against Nixon's positions. I think most of these positions are nearly frivolous, but they can be delayed in the courts. Maybe they can go straight from a trial judge to the U.S. Supreme Court. There's a mechanism for that. But how much they can be expedited, it's not going to get the report into the public's hands if Barr really, pulls up the drawbridge and says, try to cross this moat. He can delay things. Even in Nixon, it took a while to actually get the tapes turned over. So I think that, unfortunately, it could be a fairly long process. The reason I think the defenses turning over the report are frivolous, you keep hearing about the grand jury secrecy. Yes, there's grand jury secrecy, but the judge supervising the grand jury can order the transcripts turned over in the public interest. This is incredibly high public interest. Of course, they would be turned over by any rational court. But that's not a problem. This executive privilege that you hear about, this is real national security. And yes, a very few things maybe about Russian methods and how exactly, the Manafort meeting in Madrid, how they might have proven that, some informant in Madrid who might have told that, yes, of course they need to protect if it's a CIA person in Madrid. But it's one or two things like that need to be redacted. We're not talking about major redactions. Executive privilege doesn't come into play hardly at all here. What this report's going to show is what the scammers did, what the co-schemers did to further the scam done in the United States, who talked to who here, who directed who here. And so I think that it's really pretty insubstantial, the reasons to supposedly not turn over the report. I think this is really propaganda to have the letter alone sit out there for as long as the administration can have it sit out there.
Yeah, I feel that those on the right and Barr are using the word collusion to their advantage. Just because there's no collusion on a criminal sense beyond a reasonable doubt doesn't mean there's not collusion, right? And Adam Schiff took a lot of heat. 9 Republicans on the House Intel Committee asked him to resign yesterday. You're a friend of Adam Schiff, right?
Well, I am, and actually, Adam and I both worked in the Reagan administration. Now, normally you get hired as an assistant U.S. attorney on a nonpartisan basis. It's can you do the job of prosecuting people? And you can see what an able prosecutor Adam was. And he worked in the same office with me. I actually supervised him on one case when I was the head of the Southern California Fraud Task Force. We were in charge of going after investment fraud. Poor, we used to call them that. I don't know if it's politically correct, but, some poor little old lady who'd been cheated out of her life savings. We'd go after the scammer, we'd go after the boiler room. And Adam worked on one of those cases, did a very good job. One of the interesting things about Adam was that he was picked for a major espionage case. And he was not the first prosecutor, but the case had to be retried. He was the prosecutor on an FBI agent who had made a deal with the devil. He had actually, been corrupted and was guilty of espionage and prosecuted by Adam Schiff. And then Adam ran for office. And the interesting thing was that Adam did not win his first two races, but he had all the two losses in his career right at one spot. And he's not going to lose his committee chairmanship. This was just kabuki. This was just political theater. Of course, the Democrats had no power when they were in the minority, but these were just, minority members, minority, they were the Republicans who were in the minority. And they were just, we don't like you, Adam. And of course, the reason they don't like him was they were told by Trump that they're going to challenge Adam Schiff. And, this is the modus operandi. Everybody who opposes Trump has to be insulted, threatened with investigations, threatened with dismissals. This is the authoritarian, very scary side of Trump. And, people say to me sometimes, well, wasn't Reagan like this? There are things that people obviously disagreed with Reagan about politically, but Reagan absolutely was not like this.
So you do agree with Adam Schiff when he says, yes, there is collusion, right?
Well, Adam has a different charge, first of all, which is to figure out what interference was done in our election and who colluded or cooperated with it. His mandate is to make sure it doesn't happen again and to make sure that we have proper intelligence and security procedures so that we're not, hacked and have our elections controlled by the Russians. It was 2016 that we're looking at right now, but we don't want it to happen in 2020. We don't want it to be by the Chinese government, the Turkish government, by any government. That's his mandate. So, yes, he starts with what happened in 2016, but he's not looking to prosecute Trump or looking to prosecute Trump Jr. Now, if people come in and lie to his committee, and there have been instances of people coming in and lying to that committee, they can be prosecuted for perjury. But his mandate is to look at what actually happened. And it's really shocking. This used to be the Republicans' issue. This was Reagan's issue, insecurity, suspicion of the Soviet Union in those days, not Russia, but the Soviet Union. Trust but verify. Don't believe anything that you can't verify. Don't believe that, they're not doing this or they are doing that. Don't believe they have good intentions in Crimea. Don't believe that they're not invading half of Ukraine with false flag operations or whatever else they're doing. Actually, some of them are real flag operations where their operatives go in there and the kinds of things they're looking at over there in Russia. That's the kind of thing that he wants to look at. He wants to look at these bots that are interfering with the elections. There's not supposed to be any aid from a foreign government. This used to be something that the Republicans and Reagan really cared about, other people interfering with our systems in America, especially liberty, our vote. I mean, this is what makes America great. You can vote. We pick our government. People say democracy is the worst form of government, except for every other. Can you imagine? People need to stop and think, do you want to live in a land without liberty, like Russia or China? Or do you want to live in America, warts and all, where we can vote Trump out? In the 18 months, we can vote Trump out. They can't vote Putin out. They can't vote the leader in China out.
Yeah, it's kind of remarkable to watch Republicans kind of not worry about Russia right now when the last 30 years or so, that's all they've been concerned about. And to just turn that off is kind of remarkable. Going back to Barr report, I guess you could call it. Do you feel it would have been possible for Barr to read the 300 plus pages that are reportedly in the Mueller report and view all the underlying evidence and then summarize it fairly in 4 pages in less than 48 hours?
Well, I was on CNN and I said, crammers are proud everywhere, because if you could do that in why study for the course if in a day and a half you can supposedly learn all the material? I think it was nonsense. I mean, I think it was funny. It's a parody, satire, and obviously he's got a couple of smart men and women over there who helped him read the report. But no, I don't think that Barr or his staff could really absorb it. I think they went into it with the idea, like I said, he auditioned for this job. He was the best hand-picked AG that Trump could handpick, and that I think it was only Republicans thought should be confirmed for that job. So the idea this was some independent attorney general who looked at this and pored over it and tried so hard to come up with the right conclusion for the people and not for his political patron. That's a fairy tale. And he wrote this 3.5-page report, I think, with a certain idea in mind. He quoted very little from Mueller's actual report. And it's not just 300 or 400 pages, but there's also a lot of exhibits. And, one exhibit can blow it wide open. There could be one interview of somebody in there that makes you feel all different about it. And I come back to the same point, that to say that Trump is not guilty of obstruction of justice, even if he's not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So you believe he's probably guilty. He's very likely guilty. A lot of juries find him guilty. You're not confident beyond a reasonable doubt that he will surely be convicted. Well, how did that conclusion even come about if that's really the conclusion of Mueller? Let's see, after Trump would not agree to an interview, which an innocent person, people always say to me, Mr. Katz, if your client's so innocent, why won't he talk? I've had federal judges tell me that, who some of them should know better. Why doesn't your client talk? If your client's really innocent, why doesn't he come forward? Why did he take the fifth? Why did he decline all the interviews? Trump acted just like the classic criminal defendant. He refused to talk. He refused to answer any questions. You could say that's his right under the Fifth Amendment, but he didn't even have to take the Fifth Amendment. He kept threatening to fire Mueller if Mueller pushed it to that level. And if he'd have fired Mueller, let me tell you, you think the Republicans in the House and the Senate would have done anything about it? So Mueller was always walking on a banana peel as he tried to get information from Trump, the main target. And I think if he'd have made it known that he was going to indict Donald Trump Jr., there's certain things he could have done that would have definitely signaled that it was escalating. I think he would have been fired. Mueller would have been, if he'd have taken that step too. And then you have Manafort, who, as I said, instead of cooperating, which he promised to do, funneled information to the Trump team so they would be better prepared. Cohn, for a lot of the time, seemed to have a pardon dangled in front of him. That's according to his testimony. 2 lawyers showed up and dangled a pardon, said they had a back channel to Giuliani, and they've gone back and forth. But look at the problems he had with obstruction of justice, but also let's not lose the forest for the trees. He fired Comey. Comey was the investigator. Who can fire their investigator except Trump in this case? And then after he fired him, he told NBC News, I had to fire this guy because I was feeling a lot of heat on my neck about the Russia probe. That's why he fired Comey. Out of his own words, he fired Comey. He threatened Sessions repeatedly that if Sessions moved forward, he'd fire him, and he just about called him a sissy, and he made fun of Sessions' Southern accent. And then he did get rid of him. And on it went. All those FBI agents who got bounced, it's unbelievable. McCabe, this one, the other one, all got bounced. There were 2 people on the phone who apparently had a romantic, improper conversation. Forget those 2 people. He bounced 4 or 5 other people out of the FBI. After a while, people get the message of this guy is really out there to obstruct justice and not let there be a fair investigation of Russian collusion and the other things that Mueller was looking into.
So when do you think the American people will be able to see the entire Mueller report, perhaps with a few redactions?
Well, there's something from Watergate that just got released 45 years later. So people need to really put the pressure on, because if the pressure is not on from the House, but also from the American people, I think that as much stuff, and whatever the people don't pressure to see, they won't see. And so this has to become an issue. People say that we should worry about Trump's new cuts to Obamacare, what he's doing to health. I agree. All of those issues, the environment is terrible. I'm not saying take the focus away from anything else that's important. But also keep the focus on this so that the report is released, so that the House sees it, so the public sees it, so the exhibits, the interviews, the backup raw data of the report is seen. And let's also bear in mind that there are investigations going on in the Southern District of New York about the emoluments, all the people that since Trump is president suddenly find it's in their best interest, business, political, to stay at one of his hotels to try to curry favor with Trump and his administration. All of the phony charity frauds that are being investigated. I think the state AG has actually closed down the Trump charity. There's the money laundering. There's all the funny things that happened with trying to get a low tax bill, undervaluing assets, and then to try to get a big loan from a bank to try to overvalue those same assets. There's the Mar-a-Lago fiasco, where they made a claim for $17 million for storm damage to Mar-a-Lago. And a lot of people who've seen the property don't think that there was anything close to that amount of storm damage that they collected from the insurance company for supposedly having occurred. So people need to really stay tuned, not just to Mueller, but to the entire panoply of investigations.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think there's a lot to come, and I kind of feel that many Republicans are celebrating the end zone, but maybe that end zone's the wrong end zone right now.
There's a whole lot of different Republicans. The Republican Party has changed. You know, with Reagan, it was the Soviet Union, and I know people thought that he took it too far standing up to the Soviet Union. But when you look at the good, I mean, there's problems with Hungary and Poland, but they had real problems in the Cold War. They were under the thumb, they were under the absolute control of the Soviet Union and their army. There was a lot of reasons for Reagan's position during the Cold War, and tear down that wall, which is pretty funny when you hear build the wall, this totally ineffective wall. Remember, tear down the wall was Reagan, and then to get the government off people's backs. And there were some things that were not libertarian about the Reagan administration. I'll give you that, but the idea of get the government off the people's back, especially when it came to too much criminal enforcement, people going to jail for too long a period of time, people being prosecuted for, process crimes and stuff like that. And also regulation. I'm not talking about environmental regulation, but, the over-regulation. There was something to, get the government off our back, too. And now I don't see anybody saying, Trump is, Trump is an authoritarian. He's the opposite. He's get the government on your back. He may have other rhetoric, but the truth is, when you look at the policies, the government on your back, in so many things that he's pursued. He's not a libertarian. He's not a deregulator.
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, I appreciate you being on the show. You really gave us some good information, and I think we all just got to stay tuned to what happens with the Mueller report and wait for it to actually be released rather than that short summary by William Barr. Thanks again, David.
If I can make a little private pleading, I am a criminal defense attorney, and I do represent people in federal criminal trouble, but no one in the Trump administration. People in other white collar criminal trouble. That's what I do for a living. Represent people, try to help them keep the government off their back.
That's probably a good thing to have on your resume. No Trump administration clients.
Great to talk with you.
Well, that was really an insightful interview. It's always great to get an expert's take on things. And in this case, Mr. Katz really provided a lot of insight into what's going on. I would like to remind everyone to please subscribe to Krassencast on iTunes, Google Play, and YouTube. And if you'd like, please leave us a review. Every one of your reviews helps. Also, you can support us on Patreon by going to Krassencast.com. Thanks again.